I never thought revenge would be the instrument that taught me how to breathe again. But when the man I loved and the family I trusted tried to bury me alive, I chose a different end for my story. If you're new here, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Rowan. I'm 29, and for most of my life I believed in the shape of promises. The ones you make with a ring, the ones your parents make when they tuck a child into bed. I married Jonah because love felt like gravity. It pulled me in and kept me steadier than anything else. My father, Henry, had been a small-time developer with an eye for details. He'd taught me negotiation over cups of bitter coffee and how to read a contract like a confession. My mother, Lila, ran a small chain of artisan bakeries. Family dinners were loud, messy, full of jokes that had run like rivers through our years. So when the first stone fell, it cracked more than my trust. It fractured the whole landscape of my life. We were 30 minutes into what should have been a routine dinner when my sister Mira called me in the kitchen and said quietly, "Did you see the article?" My hands were wet with dough and I thought she meant a local bake sale. She stepped back, eyes rimmed with something like alarm, and slid her phone into my palm. The headline screamed, "Local firm under investigation. Major irregularities found." Jonah's name was in the subheading. I read it 3 times, then my vision blurred. Jonah walked in humming, and I knew I couldn't let the world tilt without balancing it. At first, I tried to believe mistakes were honest. Jonah had been an operations manager at a logistics company. He was pragmatic, focused, and careful with numbers in a way that felt almost devotional. He hugged me that night and whispered, "Nothing to worry about, Ro." I wanted to trust him. But trust is a fragile currency when the market collapses. Once you realize someone has embezzled the ledger of your life, you start to count what else they lied about. That week was a fracture of small things. A deleted message here, a transfer that didn't match a receipt there. I found an invoice in a drawer for a property development in a neighboring county, a property Jonah had never mentioned. The amounts were small at first, then they ballooned in a pattern that had the calculation of intent. I didn't confront him in a fit of drama. I pulled the thread. What I discovered made me sick and steady in equal measure. Jonah had not only moved company funds into a shell account, he had been moving family money too. Payments had been routed through a consultancy that bore my mother's maiden name. The rubber-stamped narrative that had kept us afloat for years, the one where the family banded together during hard times, had been leveraged into convenience for someone who wanted more than comfort. The betrayal wasn't only financial, it was personal, and poisonous because family names were used like keys to unlock vaults. When I asked Jonah about the invoices, he smiled the same smile he used to coax me into saying yes to a hike or a crazy city plan. "It's complicated," he said. "We were managing risk." The words fell like gravel. Pressed harder. He deflected. He offered me platitudes that smelled like varnish. I heard that voice and realized that if I wanted truth I would have to build a structure strong enough to hold it. Revenge would have to be clean and deliberate. Not an arson but a careful demolition that left foundations salvageable for the people who didn't deserve the collapse. So I planned. For the next 2 months I lived 2 lives. By day I was all smiles. Coffee for Jonah, quick kisses at the door, a practiced calm that fortified our facade. By night I became meticulous. I backed up bank statements in encrypted folders, cross-referenced payments, and made notes in a ledger that had once been my father's. I talked to Mira in code and watched the way her jaw tightened when I mentioned a name. She helped discreetly, passing on a supplier contact she'd heard murmured in the market, a contractor who had been paid for work that never happened. Together we built a web that, when tugged, would catch the whole spider. Revenge is less a single act than a slow weathering. I needed allies. I called a former colleague of Jonah's, Priya, who now worked in compliance at a different firm. She agreed to look at the trail if I handed her clean evidence. Nothing emotional, no accusations, just numbers. She called what she found surgical. It was the word of someone who uses scalpel precision as a compliment. Priya told me how to anonymize tips, where to leak documents so they would land in the hands of reporters who understood nuance, and how to contact an investigator who could subpoena records without tipping Jonah off. There were nights I wanted to explode. I wanted to run into the office where Jonah spent his days and scream the truth across conference rooms. But noise is sloppy. It creates witnesses who can be charmed, who can rewrite narratives into small misunderstandings. I wanted a reveal that would not be refuted by charm. I wanted a moment when the facts would sit in the room like a jury and not a crowd. Opportunity arrived in the shape of a gala, an industry dinner where Jonah's company would present its quarterly results and where investors, regulators, and board members would be present. It was theatrically symbolic, the kind of place where performance met money and where a well-timed slide could turn applause into an avalanche. The gala was 6 weeks away. That was all the time I needed. While I worked, life kept asking me to be ordinary. My mother baked scones and asked me not to worry. My father called with a clipped voice and a joke that didn't land. I learned to cook the same recipes he taught me while my hands shook behind the bowl. Revenge taught me the meaning of ordinary as disguise. You have to look like you are fine while you gather the rope that will bind the guilty. I began seeding doubt carefully. A whisper to an investor about audits, an anonymous note to a board member, a recorded voicemail accidentally left on a shared phone. These were tiny taps, enough to rattle glass but not shatter it. Then Priya fed a file to a journalist she trusted, a piece with timestamps, transfers, and a pattern that traced funds back to the consultancy that used my mother's maiden name. The journalist called me for comment, politely, as if we were colleagues talking about a trend. I told her the facts I had and nothing else. She said, "We'll run this when it's airtight." Night after night, I memorized the slide sequence I would use if I had to present. The idea made me uncomfortable. Exposing a husband publicly felt like tearing down a private thing in a square where everyone could see. But secrecy had been the lubricant for their theft. Transparency would be the solvent to clean it. The gala night arrived in a wash of champagne and polished shoes. Jonah appeared in a suit the way men appear in armor, confident and ready to charm. His smile was practiced. He greeted me like a purchased accessory. I sat beneath a chandelier, clove-scented air moving like a curtain around whispered negotiations. Investors chatted about markets and returns. The MC announced that Jonah would speak. He'd present a summary of the quarter and highlight the strategic realignments that justified minor variances. It was the kind of speech designed to soothe. When he took the stage, I felt my pulse like a drum in my throat. I rose from my seat and, to my own surprise, walked to the podium. The room's hum shifted. I was an interruption, a question. The chairman's eyes narrowed. Jonah froze momentarily, a tilt of the head that betrayed confusion and a flash of calculation. "What now?" I smiled because my face could be a weapon too. "I'd like to speak," I said, and the voice that came was steady. I had rehearsed the cadence in the car on the way there. "There are some facts the investors deserve to know." I clicked my phone and a slide projected behind Jonah's planned presentation. Numbers, transfers, exact dates, client names. The auditorium went quiet, the silence immediate as a held breath. Jonah's face went from color to ash in seconds. I read the ledger aloud, not with malice but with the clinical precision of someone presenting evidence to a court. The consultancy name flashed on the screen, my mother's maiden name, and the transfers that tracked cash into private accounts. Cameras leaned in. Phones recorded. The room that had expected a tailored speech got a deposition instead. Chaos unfurled after that slow second of silence. Jonah tried to speak, to soothe, to claim misinterpretation. Investors demanded papers. The CEO called for an emergency audit. Reporters who'd been sipping cocktails now had an appetite for headlines. Jonah's supporters scattered like pigeons. Some people stood up in defense of the company. Others stood with me, holding folders and copies of evidence Priya had helped assemble. After the event, the fallout was immediate. Regulators opened inquiries. Jonah's access to accounts was frozen. The consultancy's registrations were investigated. My mother stood at my side in the lobby for a minute, her hands white around a coffee cup, and then her knees buckled. She was not complicit in the way the numbers suggested, at least not at first. She had signed promises made under whispers, promises meant to shield the family, but she had not expected the ledger to become a map for someone else's greed. Her face crumpled under the weight of the consequences. Revenge is complicated by collateral damage. The firm's junior employees were scared. Suppliers called. People who had no role in the conspiracy suffered the tremors of the truth. I slept poorly for weeks, waking with the taste of metal in my mouth. But I also felt a slow clearing. There is a kind of moral clarity that follows naming. When you point out the rot, it loses the power to pretend it's an ordinary bruise. Action was not yet over. Jonah, cornered, tried to negotiate. He offered to sign documents, to admit to minor mistakes, to pay fines and repair reputations in exchange for silence. He came to the apartment once in the morning, face ashen, begging me to believe his love had been enough. I listened, and when he finished I told him, quietly, that love without truth is a dangerous placebo. He left with a suitcase and the kind of shame that looks like a man still in love with his own image. Months later, legal proceedings played out. There were trials and settlements. Jonah pleaded guilty to several counts related to embezzlement and was sentenced to prison time that fitted the scope of his theft, not as a vengeance but as a public accounting. The consultancy was dissolved. Funds were partially recovered. My parents faced a community that had always loved them with a mix of pity and anger. My mother, in the end, did what she could to rebuild the repair she had once thwarted, volunteering, paying restitution where possible, and learning that protection that requires secrecy can become a betrayal. I learned something I had not expected during that slow unspooling. Revenge, when guided by a sense of repair, can be less about the collapse and more about a new architecture. I used some of the recovered funds to ensure employees continued to get paid during the audits. I set up meetings with suppliers and negotiated staggered payments so livelihoods wouldn't collapse. I wanted to make sure the truth didn't become a cudgel that only crushed the small and the vulnerable. Years later, the stain is memory and not identity. Jonah is a footnote in my past. My parents still live in the house where my father taught me to plane a tabletop. They have rebuilt some semblance of public life. Smaller dinners, quieter laughter. I run a consultancy now that helps small businesses set governance structures that prevent the very patterns Jonah exploited. I teach others to read the small signs and to act before the web becomes a cage. My life is quieter in some ways and richer in others. I have friends who stayed, friends who left, and a resilience I measure in simple things. A weekend walk without checking my phone, a dinner with Mira where we talk about nothing for hours. If there is a lesson here, it is not a tidy moral. People you love will sometimes hurt you with intentions you cannot imagine. Revenge can feel sweet at first, but it can hollow you if you let it. The trick, the hard, unforgiving trick, is to pair demand for accountability with a plan to repair what your actions unavoidably break. That, more than vengeance, is the work that makes a life worth reclaiming. So tell me, would you expose a lie that cost you everything but might save others? Or would you walk away quietly and protect yourself? Tell me where you're watching from. I read every reply.